Okay, so today we're going to be talking about thesis statements. So the thesis statement is one of the most important things in your essay because it is clearly and specifically telling the person who's reading your essay what your essay is supposed to be arguing. So if I don't know or your thesis statement is not clear to me, then it's going to be really hard for me to mark your essay. And in future, when you get to the point where you're writing essays in, say, university or something, if you're writing something like your thesis, which is a bit different than a thesis statement, then it's a large paper about a particular topic. So you may want to publish that later on. And if you're publishing it, then the thesis or the thing that you're arguing in it becomes very important. So when you're writing a thesis statement, it needs to be clear and specific. This is really, really important. Don't try to jam every part of your argument into that thesis statement. Make it nice and clear and specific and to the point. I find a lot of students are surprised when I say that a thesis statement can be quite short, but it doesn't need to be long to explain what you're arguing. Like, for example, you might be arguing that Romeo and Juliet were a bad couple. So you might just say Romeo and Juliet were not suited for each other, or were a bad couple, or were negative to each other, or something like that. Nice and short, not a bunch of things shoved into one statement. So this kind of goes through a few things that you want to make sure your thesis is and is not. So the first thing is it shouldn't be a statement of fact or an observation, but an assertion. So it shouldn't be you just saying something that everybody knows. Like in this example, saying something like The Great Gatsby was written by F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's not an argument whether or not F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby. We know that that's the case, but saying that it's his most personal piece of work is something that someone could argue with you about or say that's not true. It takes a stand. It doesn't just announce a subject. So if you say something like capital punishment is a societal issue, yes, it is a societal issue. It's an issue in our society. That is not something that someone would argue with you about because there are people in our society who agree with it, disagree with it, are neutral, that kind of thing. Whereas if you were to say that it's inherently wrong, then that is you taking a stand on it. You're not just saying this is a subject that I'm going to talk about. It has to be the main idea, not the title of the essay. So it has to be a complete sentence, not a sentence fragment. So if you say something like misogyny in Hamlet, that is a sentence fragment. It doesn't have all the parts necessary in a sentence, and you have no idea necessarily what you're arguing about misogyny in Hamlet. Whereas if you say something like the most prominent theme in Hamlet is misogyny, then you're taking a stand because someone may say, well, death is a more prominent theme or something like that. Or maybe they might say that Hamlet is not misogynistic at all. It is narrow, not broad. So if you try to make it too broad, it's going to be too difficult to prove. And you'll notice this when you do make your thesis too broad, because then when you're trying to figure out your arguments, you'll have a really hard time narrowing down what your argument should be. So if you say something like poverty is a problem in the world, that's way too big. You would have to write pages and pages and pages and pages to prove that's true. Whereas if you focus in, like in the strong thesis example, in a particular country, like it being a major issue in India, then it's a lot easier to prove because then you can make your arguments surrounding poverty in India rather than poverty in all sorts of different countries that looks different in different places. A thesis statement is specific rather than vague or general. So a thesis statement is very specific to one particular, say, theme, point, spot in the play, whatever. It's not something that generally covers like all of Shakespeare's tragedy, for example. So if you just say something like Hamlet is a play in which many symbols are present, or one of the ones that I know students always find online when they're trying to figure out their thesis for Hamlet is that it has 7 soliloquies. Yes, it does. Yes, those soliloquies are important. But why are they important? You do not want your thesis to be a so what kind of thesis where I'm asking you, why is this something I should care about? So a stronger thesis would be a situation where maybe you pick a particular symbol like disease and decay, for example. The next part, a thesis statement has one main point rather than several main points. So if you have too many things that you're trying to cover, again, then it may be too difficult to come up with one clear, cohesive argument, which means you may go off into all sorts of different tangents and then not really prove your point overall. So if you say something like teenagers should not be allowed to vote, drive, or drink, that's too many things to try and argue in one essay. You could write 3 separate essays on each different point, like in the strong thesis, where it picks one of those things to focus in on, specifically drinking. rather than trying to focus on all of them, because talking about why a teenager shouldn't be allowed to drive as opposed to why teenagers shouldn't be allowed to drink are going to be two different things. They may have some overlapping ideas, but they're not the same. And then we'll go through a few common thesis errors. So one of the big thesis errors is if you write a thesis that's a run-on or a sentence fragment. You want it to be a proper sentence, because once you start having a bunch of grammatical errors in your work, it is really hard to read and understand. And that's something I will kind of really keep hitting over the head for you throughout this course, is that the more grammatical issues you have in a piece of writing, the more difficult it is for me to understand, and the harder it is for me to give you a good mark. If I don't know what you're trying to say, I don't have the information to be able to give you a good mark. And especially with something like your thesis, you want it to be clear, specific, and to the point. So it can't be a run-on. You can't be just putting stuff down, including way too many ideas in one sentence. And you also can't have it a sentence fragment, because then you haven't even expressed one full idea. Certainly, and one of the biggest things that you never should do is write a thesis that's a form of a question. So do not ask a question in your thesis. Your thesis should be the answer to a question, not a question itself. Writing a thesis that contains a personal opinion. Here's a big issue that I see still in 4U, even though I should not, where a thesis contains the phrase I in it. Immediately take off that I. Like if you say, I think Hamlet is Shakespeare's greatest tragedy, you're immediately making it sound like you are the only person who feels that way, and other people, don't or shouldn't feel that way. Whereas if you take that I think right off, just pull it right off the front and say Hamlet is Shakespeare's greatest tragedy, then it becomes a universal statement, which becomes a lot stronger piece than that I think. I should not see the word I unless it is actually in a quotation spoken by a character anywhere in a literary essay. And I wouldn't try to put it in most essays, because as soon as you add in that I, it really narrows it down to your opinion only, rather than it being a general truth. If you write a thesis that's too vague, or it has information that's not necessary, like you start to include your blueprint points in your thesis without any reason, then that becomes problematic as well. So try to keep it specific and clear and to the point. Not every essay requires a thesis. So number 5 here is talking about how there's different types of essays, which you may have learned about last year. We won't focus on them too much in 4U. We're really going to focus in on creating great arguments. But things like a narrative or an expository essay doesn't necessarily have a thesis. However, the essays you will write for me in this course will need an arguable thesis. So don't write me a research essay that is just, giving me general information and not actually proving a point. A thesis does not always have to come at the end of the first paragraph of an essay. So you do learn in grade 9 a particular way to write essays, sort of like a formula. The reason why we teach you that in grade 9 is because you're in grade 9. So you kind of need to get that background information and that basis before you can start to play with it. Now we're in grade 12, so now I want you to play around with it, put that thesis where it makes sense. Assuming that you can't write your essay until you've perfected your thesis, I'm going to tell you so many times to play around and brainstorm and get ideas out there, and don't be worried about what you're writing. So go back and edit at the end, but get those ideas down, because if you don't write them down when you have them, then they're not going to be there for you to go back to. And your thesis may change as you write your essay. So it may start out with one thing and you may add to it or change it or whatever, and that's okay. That's a perfectly acceptable thing to do. And assuming that you have to explain how you're going to argue your thesis within your thesis. I would like to see your blueprint or a general idea of how you're going to argue your thesis in your intro paragraph at some point, but it certainly does not need to be within that one sentence that is the thesis. So now that we've gone through some things and some reminders about writing a thesis, you're going to be working on a practice sheet for thesis statements.